Australia, the land of stunning coastlines, vibrant cities, and unique wildlife, is also known for its vast and empty spaces. Despite being one of the largest countries in the world, over 95% of its land remains sparsely populated. This intriguing paradox raises important questions about geography, climate, and human settlement. Australia is a continent of extremes. It is the sixth largest country by land area, stretching across 7.7 million square kilometers. To give you a sense of its vastness, imagine fitting two entire countries like India within its borders. That's how immense it is. Yet, despite its size, 95% of Australia is almost entirely deserted. Imagine a place so wide and open, yet so empty. If you look at a map and see those little yellow dots, those represent where people live. Astonishingly, 90% of Australia's population is huddled together in just 0.22% of its land. That's less than 1% of the country. Most Australians live in just 5 cities: Sydney, Brisbane, Perth, Adelaide, and Melbourne. The further you venture away from these urban areas and into the heart of Australia, the more inhospitable and dangerous the land becomes. To put Australia's size and population into perspective, it's helpful to compare with other places around the world. Australia is about the same size as the lower 48 states of the US, a region that houses over 300 million people. Yet, Australia's population is just over 26 million. In fact, two American states, California, with over 39 million residents, and Texas, with more than 28 million, each have more people than the entire Australian continent. Looking at Europe, England alone, without the rest of the UK, has a population more than double that of Australia. Globally, 7 islands have populations exceeding Australia's. These include Great Britain, Honshu, Luzon, Mindanao, Java, Sumatra, and Madagascar. Java alone, despite being 60 times smaller than Australia, boasts nearly 6 times its population. Several global cities also surpass Australia in population size. Metropolitan areas like Tokyo, Jakarta, and Delhi have more residents than the whole of Australia. Cities such as Shanghai, Seoul, Sao Paulo, Mexico City, New York City, Cairo, Lagos, Mumbai, and Moscow have populations comparable to or larger than Australia's. Australia's population is heavily concentrated in a few major cities: Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, and Adelaide. These urban centers are home to nearly two-thirds of all Australians. This means about 90% of the population lives near the coast, with only 15% living more than 50 kilometers inland. This concentration highlights Australia's status as one of the most urbanized nations globally, with urban areas covering just 0.22% of the continent's land area. The interior of Australia is sparsely populated for several reasons. The Shire of East Pilbara in Western Australia, for instance, is as large as Japan, but has only about 10,000 people, half of whom live in Newman. Similarly, the pastoral unincorporated area in South Australia, roughly the size of France, is home to just 3,750 residents, translating to a population density of about 178 square kilometers per person. Anna Creek Station, a privately owned cattle ranch larger than Israel, employs just 8 full-time staff and supports around 10,000 cattle. Australia's vastness is further emphasized by the long distances between towns. A drive from Esperance on the south coast to Kununurra near the north coast covers about 3,200 kilometers and can take 35 hours, passing through only about 70,000 people. This journey, in terms of time and distance, is comparable to traveling from Madrid to Istanbul across Europe, a region with a much higher population density. The sparse population can be attributed to Australia's challenging environment. The continent's geography and climate play a significant role in its low population density. Located near Antarctica, Western Australia faces cold ocean currents from the Southern Ocean, which limit rainfall and cloud formation. The Great Dividing Range, Australia's longest mountain range, blocks rain clouds from the Pacific, creating a rain shadow over much of the continent. Additionally, Australia has the lowest average elevation among all continents, and its tallest mountain, Mount Kosciuszko, is only 2,228 meters high. In contrast, Other continents have much higher peaks, and Colorado in the US alone has a significantly higher average elevation. Australia's climate is influenced by its position along the Tropic of Capricorn, with the northern region in the tropics and the southern part in the subtropics. The subtropical high-pressure belt dominates this region, warming and drying the air and reducing rainfall. The continent also experiences the effects of El Niño and La Niña, which can lead to prolonged droughts and exacerbate bushfires. Despite having substantial freshwater resources, estimated at 492 cubic kilometers, more than many more populous countries, Australia struggles with water scarcity due to uneven distribution and high evaporation rates. The Murray-Darling Basin, Australia's most significant river system, supports around 3 million people and is crucial for agriculture, producing a large portion of the nation's food. However, climate change is exacerbating drought conditions, reducing water availability. But why is this? Why does such a vast and beautiful land remain largely uninhabited? The answer is deeply intriguing, yet also quite haunting. Australia is often seen as a mysterious country, partly because of the painful history that explains why most of its land is so empty, a history that has been hidden from many of us, including people in India and around the world. Australia's story begins with its first inhabitants, the Aboriginal people, who lived here long before any Europeans set foot on its shores. But today, when you look across Australia, you mostly see people of European descent. So what happened to the Aboriginals? We're all familiar with the brutalities the British inflicted on India. Millions of lives lost, widespread torture, and exploitation. But what about the Aboriginals in Australia? The truth is that the British colonizers unleashed unimaginable horrors upon them as well. This dark chapter of Australian history, where the Aboriginals faced persecution, violence, and displacement, is a story that has been largely buried and hidden from the world's view. Understanding this history is key to understanding why so much of Australia remains uninhabited. It's not just the harsh landscape or the challenging climate. It's also the scars left behind by a painful and often overlooked past. To grasp the beginnings of Australia's complex history, we need to rewind to the year 1606, when the continent was first sighted by European explorers. But long before this, Australia was home to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. These original inhabitants lived in harmony with the land, relying on the forest for their food, medicines, and tools. Their connection to the land was spiritual rather than economic. They didn't see land as something that could be owned, bought, or sold. For them, the idea of fencing off land or claiming ownership was completely alien. During the 17th century, European powers were on a relentless quest to discover new territories and resources. They had already begun exploiting vast regions of the world, including India, Africa, and the Americas. On January 26, 1788, a group of British settlers arrived at Botany Bay, an area that is now part of modern-day Sydney. Upon realizing that the indigenous people did not claim ownership of the land in the way Europeans understood, the British saw an enormous opportunity. They even gave this land a new label, Terra Nullius, which means land belonging to no one or no man's land. At first, the Aboriginal Australians greeted these newcomers with openness, unaware of the drastic changes that were about to unfold. But the British settlers were not just ordinary people. They brought with them convicts from their homeland, including thieves, robbers, murderers, and others convicted of various crimes. The British had a particular plan in mind. They intended to transform Australia into a penal colony. A penal colony is a place where convicts are sent to serve their sentences through hard labor, often in harsh and unforgiving conditions. This was similar to what the British did in India with the infamous Kalapani, the Andaman Islands penal colony, where Indian freedom fighters were sent as punishment. The arrival of the British marked the beginning of a dramatic and often tragic transformation for Australia. The concept of terra nullius not only disregarded the deep connection that the Aboriginal people had with their land, but also paved the way for the British to claim and colonize Australia without any acknowledgement of the existing population's rights or sovereignty. This was the start of a painful chapter in Australian history, one that would have lasting impacts on the land and its people. From 1788 to 1868, the British government transported thousands of criminals to Australia, turning it into a vast penal colony. But while this massive operation was underway, the indigenous peoples of Australia, who had lived on the land for thousands of years, were largely unaware of what was happening. In the early days, they had no idea that the British had come up with plans to establish a penal settlement. How could they have known? The British arrived with deceptive intentions, painting a picture of mutual prosperity and seeking permission to settle on just a small portion of the land. But this initial request was just the beginning. The British had much grander plans, similar to the strategy in India with the East India Company, where they slowly expanded their control. The arrival of the British had profound and devastating consequences for the indigenous populations of Australia. One of the most immediate and deadly impacts was the introduction of new diseases. The British brought with them illnesses like bronchitis, measles, scarlet fever, chickenpox, smallpox, and whooping cough, diseases completely unknown to the native Australians. These communities had no natural immunity to these foreign diseases, and the consequences were catastrophic. In Sydney alone, within just a year, smallpox had wiped out 50% of the indigenous population. A similar tragedy unfolded in the Port Phillip area, where half of the population was decimated almost overnight due to disease. These outbreaks continued year after year, relentlessly claiming lives. What makes this situation even more heartbreaking is that the British, despite having the knowledge and resources to treat these diseases, chose not to help. They stood by and watched as the indigenous populations were ravaged by illness, doing nothing to alleviate their suffering. This pattern of neglect was not unique to Australia. A similar tragedy occurred in India in the early 1900s, when diseases like cholera, smallpox, and malaria swept through the country. Over 3 million Indians died during these epidemics, and despite having access to vaccines and medical treatments, the British colonial authorities did little to save lives. In both cases, the colonial powers prioritized their interests over the lives of the people they were supposed to govern, leaving a legacy of pain and loss that continues to resonate today. The arrival of the British in Australia had far-reaching and devastating consequences for the indigenous peoples. Initially, the British took only a small portion of the land, but it wasn't long before they began expanding their territory. They started fencing off more and more of Australia, spreading rapidly across regions that would become modern-day Hobart, Melbourne, and Brisbane. This encroachment wasn't just about land, it was about power and control. As the British fenced off these lands, they imposed harsh restrictions on the indigenous people. They were prohibited from hunting on their lands, denied access to clean water, and were no longer allowed to gather food from areas that had been fenced off. In essence, the British were stripping the indigenous Australians of their basic means of survival. The situation quickly worsened. The British began to dominate the indigenous populations, forcing them into labor on their ancestral lands. The brutality didn't stop there. Indigenous women and children were subjected to horrific abuses, including rape and exploitation. The depths of cruelty reached unimaginable levels when pregnant women were forced into dangerous labor, such as diving into deep waters to collect pearls, with no consideration for their well-being or that of their unborn children. As these injustices mounted, the indigenous Australians could no longer endure the oppression. By 1795, they began to resist, leading to a conflict that would last for the next century. This war wasn't just a series of battles. It was a prolonged and brutal struggle for survival. Over 100 years, countless smaller skirmishes and large-scale conflicts unfolded, each one chipping away at the indigenous population. The devastation was staggering. By the end of this period, 90% of the indigenous Australians had been wiped out. What was once a vibrant population, estimated to be between 3 and 7.5 million, was reduced to a mere 30,000 to 75,000 by the year 1900. This catastrophic decline was not a reflection of a general population drop in Australia. While traders from other nations, including Germans, Chinese, and Japanese, had settled in Australia, contributing to a population of around 5 million, it was the indigenous Australians who bore the brunt of the devastation. The British, however, were not satisfied with just displacing and decimating the indigenous population. They found another cruel method to further erode their numbers: by conscripting indigenous Australians who fought in the world wars, sending them to distant battlefields, where many of them would never return.